Okay. So by introduction, I want to put a quote from International Ethical Standards Board 2018, which says, the distinguishing mark of the accounting profession is its acceptance of the responsibility to act in the public interest. So a professional accountant does not serve only the needs of an individual client or employing organization, but the needs of various classes of stakeholders, creditors, investors, government, and the other sectors of the business community. Stakeholders rely on the accountant for accurate information to enable them take informed decisions. So accounting profession requires discipline because the accountants are human beings. The professional accountant requires a set of moral values or standards to work in the public interest. So the International Ethical Standards Board for Accountants provides the code for professional ethics to regulate professional behavior and the conduct of professional accountants, and to protect the image of the accountancy profession. So the code contains requirements and application material that enable the accountant carry out responsibilities in the interest of the public. IESBA is an independent body setting standards for use by professional accountants worldwide, bearing in mind their public interest responsibility. I know various other countries of the world, especially members of IFAC, draw their local ethical standards from the international ethical standards. So the International Code of Ethics for Professional Accountants was prepared and issued by the International Ethics Standard Board for Accountants in the year 2001. This code was revised in April 2018 with the implementation date of June 16, 2019. By the letter given to us, we are asked to focus on this, and that is where my presentation is substantially anchored. So section 110 of the code prescribes the fundamental principles of ethics for professional accountants with regard to their responsibility to act in the public interest. And that code requires professional accountants to comply with the fundamental principles of ethics. Neglect of ethics in accounting profession has been a challenging issue in recent times. We have had about collapse of businesses. We have had about disclosure, auditors, and other stakeholders making decisions without adequate information, and a whole lot of them. So it has been a challenging issue. That is why I appreciate the organizers for bringing this conference and the team at this time. So what are these fundamental principles of the code? The fundamental principles the professional accountant must comply with, as set out by the code, are integrity, objectivity, professional competence and due care, confidentiality, and professional behavior. They, as a principle, should be honest, to be straightforward in dealing with clients and others. It demands that professional accountants should be fair and truthful in business relationships with others. 1A1. A professional accountant should not be associated with reports, returns, communications, or statements the accountant knows and believes contain materially false and misleading information. A professional accountant should not be associated with recklessly provided information provided recklessly, because that information may contain false ideas or false matters, required information, especially where such omission or obscurity will be misleading. If the professional accountant becomes aware of the misleading statement, what should he do? The accountant can take necessary steps to be disciplined. Is a lot abused in professional business relationship today, and that is why this conference is very, very important. The second one is principle of objectivity. This principle requires that the professional accountant should not compromise professional or business judgment because of bias, because of conflict of interest, or undue influence of others. The professional accountant shall not take any activity or engagement where relationship or circumstances will unduly influence the accountant's professional judgment concerning that activity. The objectivity principle imposes an obligation on the professional accountant to be free from conflict of interest and maintain objectivity and judgment. He knows that he will maintain his objectivity. He has to be free from conflict of interest to be able to do that. Professional accountant. Professional competence and due care is a principle imposes on the professional accountant to possess adequate skill and knowledge for the service required by the client or employing organization. The accountant should also be diligent at work and they render services in accordance with applicable technical and professional standards. The professional accountant should render services in accordance with the requirements of the engagement, carefully, thoroughly, and on timely basis. He has to maintain professional competence and due care by acquiring on continuous basis knowledge of relevant technical, professional, and business developments. It should be an ongoing thing that a professional accountant is updating him or herself on a regular basis to be relevant in technical matters, professional and business development. The professional accountant maintains capabilities to perform competently within the professional environment. The professional accountant should be aware of recent developments in technical and professional business. Like we have new issues, especially my area, financial accounting. It keeps changing, it keeps evolving. So a professional accountant should continue to update himself or herself in that area. And not only this, the professional accountant must ensure that those working in a professional capacity have appropriate training and supervision. It's also a responsibility for the professional accountant. We look at the fourth one, principle of confidentiality. Confidentiality principle demands that a professional accountant should maintain confidentiality with any information obtained from the client. The information must be kept in absolute confidence unless demanded by the state or for public interest. The professional accountant should maintain confidentiality of information with the employing organization or information obtained from business relationship outside the entity. Must maintain confidentiality of information disclosed by prospective client. So there are different means through which you can obtain information. Confidential information obtained from professional and business relationship by the professional accountant should not be used for personal advantage or advantage of a third party. The information obtained should not be disclosed even after the relationship has ended. Should not be disclosed by personnel under the accountant's control or supervision. However, there are circumstances under which the professional accountant must be required to disclose confidential information, such as where the disclosure is required by law, or where the disclosure is permitted by law and it is authorized by the client, or where there is a professional duty or right to disclose when not prohibited by law. And it is not prohibited by law if the disclosure is to comply with the quality review of a professional body, or is for response to an inquiry or investigation by a professional or regulatory body, or is to protect the professional interest of a professional accountant in legal proceedings, or comply with the technical and professional standards, including ethics requirements. In such situations, disclosure is not prohibited. The last is the principle of professional behavior. This principle guides against any behavior that will discredit the profession. A professional accountant is expected to render services in such a way that the image of the profession is not diminished. The professional accountant should comply with relevant laws and regulations and should avoid any action that discredits the profession. To comply with this principle, the professional accountant needs to observe relevant laws and regulations guiding the accountant's duties. The accountant should not engage in any business or activity that might impair the good reputation of the profession. Because once one person fails to observe professional ethics, people will conclude that is what they do. Professional accountants, that is what they do. The professional accountant should not engage in such conducts that will make an informed third party to conclude adversely on the good reputation of the profession. Then Section 120 of the code talks about threats. Threats are circumstances or relationships that can compromise a professional accountant's compliance with the fundamental principles. Like there are temptations around professional accountants that may lure them into non-compromise with the principles we have mentioned earlier. So the circumstances in which a professional accountant operates might create threats to compliance with the fundamental principles. Threats can be created by a wide range of facts and the circumstances. Section 126A2. Additionally, the nature of engagements and the work assignments might also create different types of threats. Hence, it is difficult to define all the circumstances and situations that create threats in this code. There are limited ones. It's not exhaustive, that the code cannot contain all of them because it depends on the nature of engagement. There's no way the code can list out all the circumstances, all the facts that can create threat, but we are giving some of them. So Section 1206A3 specifies the categories into which threats to compliance with the fundamental principles fall as follows. Self-interest threat. This threat is created by financial or other interests of the professional accountant or of an immediate or close family member. Financial interest can inappropriately influence the judgment or behavior of a professional accountant. Other interests, such as gift, can also influence the judgment of the professional accountant. Self-interest. Then we come to self-review threat. This is created when the professional accountant has to reevaluate the previous judgment made by the accountant, or when the accountant relies on previously performed activity by the accountant or by another individual within the accountant's firm or employing organization in judging performance of a current activity. And the threat is that the professional accountant will not appropriately evaluate the results of a previous judgment, might not see anything wrong with the previous judgment. That is why the code has come to moderate, to really give accurate background concerning this self-interest threat. We also have advocacy threat, the threat that a professional accountant will promote a client's or employer's position to the point that the accountant's objectivity is compromised. It is created when a professional accountant is acting as a promoter of a client's business. The familiarity threat. This threat is created by a long or close relationship with a client. It is the threat that due to long or close relationship with a client or employer, a professional accountant will be too sympathetic to the interest of others or too accepting of their work. It's a threat. And the last one is intimidation threat. This is a threat that the professional accountant will be discouraged from acting objectively because of actual or perceived pressures, including attempts to exercise undue influence over the accountant. You know, it's very common, especially for those in the public service. Note that a threat might affect compliance with one or more fundamental principles, and a circumstance might create more than one threat. Let's talk about the conceptual framework. Section 120. Section 121 of the code sets out requirements, the application materials, and the conceptual framework to assist the accountant in complying with the fundamental principles and meeting their responsibility to act in the public interest. The code provides application materials on various circumstances to help the professional accountant apply the conceptual framework. The conceptual framework is like an approach to handle threats as the professional accountant renders service, which must be to the public interest. So Section 123 requires a professional accountant to apply the conceptual framework in identifying threats to compliance with the fundamental principles. 2, to evaluating the threats identified and in addressing the threats by eliminating or reducing them to an acceptable level. The professional accountant must consider the context in which the ethical issues might arise. So how is the conceptual framework applied? In applying the conceptual framework to identify, evaluate, and address threats, the code requires that the professional accountant must exercise professional judgment. The professional accountant must remain alert for new information and changes in facts and circumstances, and use the reasonable and informed third-party test, or apply the informed third-party test. And the exercise of professional judgment requires that the professional accountant should bring to bear on his decisions relevant training he has acquired, professional knowledge, skill, and experience that match the facts and circumstances. It involves understanding the nature and scope of the particular professional activities, the interests and relationships involved. It also requires making informed decisions about the course of action available and to determine whether such decisions are appropriate in the circumstance. The professional accountant shall identify threats to compliance with the fundamental principles. And they must first understand the facts and the circumstance, professional activities, interests and relationship that might compromise compliance with the fundamental principles, certain conditions, policies, and procedures established by the profession, legislation, regulation of the firm or the employing organization that can enhance the accountant's acting ethically. Are there some policies, procedures, conditions already established known by the profession? But what about the entity, the employing organization? Are there legislation, regulations, or established as well that can enhance the accountant's acting ethically? We should ascertain all this in identifying threats to compliance. So the conceptual framework recognizes that certain conditions, as I mentioned earlier, policies and the procedures established by the profession and legislation, regulation established by the firm or the employing organization might impact the identification of threats. And we are giving examples of corporate governance requirements, educational training and experience requirements for the profession, effective complaint systems in the organization which can enable the professional accountant and the general public to draw attention to unethical behavior. Any explicit stated duty to report breaches of ethical requirements, professional or regulatory monitoring, and disciplinary procedures in the organization. That will go a long way to help the professional accountant in identifying threats. And on identification of any of these threats created by any circumstance, the professional accountant has to assess whether such a threat is at an acceptable level. Section 127A1 defines an acceptable level of threat as a level at which a professional accountant, using the reasonable and informed third-party test, would likely conclude that the accountant complies with the fundamental principles. Third party, reasonable and informed third party. That one, a reasonable and informed third party, is one who possesses the relevant knowledge and the experience to understand and evaluate the appropriateness of the professional accountant's conclusion in an impartial manner. The person may not be an accountant, but he has knowledge, adequate knowledge and experience to understand and evaluate the appropriateness of the decision of the professional accountant. The reasonable and informed third-party test is a consideration by the professional accountant about whether the same conclusion would likely be reached by another party. And he does it from the perspective of a reasonable and informed third party, assuming what I have decided, another person who has the reasonable knowledge and experience will also come out with the same result or with the same conclusion I have made. Evaluating threats. In evaluating the level of threats, the professional accountant needs to consider some relevant factors such as the existence of conditions, policies, and procedures, as mentioned before, the corporate governance in place, the educational training and experience requirements for the profession, effective compliance system that will enable professional accountants and the public to draw attention to unethical behavior, any stated duty to report breaches of ethics requirements, professional or regulatory monitoring and disciplinary procedure. All these are important areas to consider in identifying threats as also in evaluating threats. The professional accountant in evaluating threats should be at alert for new information or changes in facts and circumstances. What he had already collected, the facts and circumstances, he should be at alert to see whether there are new information that may affect what he has. The professional accountant must remain alert for new information or changes in facts and circumstances. New information can affect the level of threats, can reduce the threat to an acceptable level, or the accountant's conclusion on the threat. If new information emerges or changes in facts and circumstances occur, a professional accountant should reevaluate and address the threat accordingly. New information may affect the accountant's conclusion about safeguards applied, whether they will continue to be appropriate to address identified threats. New information may also result in an identification of new threats. When that occurs, the professional accountant must revisit the process and the procedures he has followed in addressing the new threats. He must go ahead to address the threat if it's new. Addressing threats continues. If an identified threat is not within the acceptable level, the professional accountant should address the threat by eliminating the circumstances, including interest relationships that are creating threats should be eliminated. Can also apply safeguards where available to reduce the threats to an acceptable level. Safeguards are actions individually or in combination that the professional accountant takes that effectively reduce threats to compliance with the fundamental principles to an acceptable level. Where threat cannot be eliminated and the safeguards cannot be applied to reduce the threat to an acceptable level, threat can be addressed by declining or ending the specific professional activity. That's the last resort where threat cannot be eliminated and no safeguard can be applied to reduce the level of the threat. Judgments and overall conclusion reached by the professional accountant. There must be an overall conclusion about whether the action that the accountant takes or intends to take to address the threat created will eliminate those threats or reduce them to an acceptable level. In forming the overall conclusion, the accountant should review any significant judgments made or conclusion reached using the reasonable and informed third-party test. A consideration by the professional accountant about whether the same conclusion will likely be reached by another party. Now, looking at this from the professional accountants in business, a professional accountant in business is an employee of an organization will be a contractor, a partner, director, executive or non-executive, owner, manager, or volunteer of an employing organization or an employer. And this we find in section 200 of the code. Investors, creditors, employing organization, government, other sectors of the business community, as well as the general public, they all rely on the work of the professional accountant. And the professional accountant has different relationships with all these groups. So the accountant's interaction with these various groups results in various facts and circumstances that could create threat to compliance with fundamental principles. Still, professional accountants in business, section 200 of the code does not describe all the facts and circumstances, professional activities, interests, and relationships that the professional accountant in business can encounter. The professional accountant in business must comply with the fundamental principles as set out in section 110 and the conceptual framework spelled out in section 120 in identifying, evaluating, and addressing threats, as we have looked at. So it's the same thing the professional accountant in business will do, using or applying the conceptual framework in identifying, evaluating, and addressing threats to compliance. The professional accountant has a duty to further the legitimate objective of the accountant employer. And when doing that, the professional accountant may end up promoting the position of the organization, provided that the accountant does not give or make false or misleading statements. The professional accountant at a higher level, a higher position, has more access to information. He can influence policies, he can influence decisions or actions taken by others involved with the employer, can influence